Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm broadcasting today from Taipei, Taiwan, where the weather is getting really bad outside. But speaking of Mother Nature, as I talked about in my monologue, Mother Nature sometimes gets really unhappy, and the consequences are extreme. So we're very honored to have back with us Ejike Okpa from the Big D, Dallas, right? I can remember the
Yes.
Big D.
Exactly.
And I appreciate once again you getting up early to be on the show. Sadly, today we are going to talk about Mother Nature and what's happening there in Texas. Can you walk us through a little bit about the flooding and what's going on there?
Hey, Dane, thank you for having me. My prayers and best wishes for the families who've lost, loved ones, and then for those who are being, trying to find and rescue. It's a very devastating weekend. You know, it- when stuff like this happens, it makes you wonder, is there anything anybody could have done? And oftentimes the answer is no, because, like you said in your opening, Mother Nature is more powerful, and I've always wondered where is Father Nature, and like you said, in marriages we know who controls things, but sometimes it makes you wonder who are, what can human beings do in order to do what they say, oh, never again, but then it happens again. The flood in Texas, in the Guadalupe River, the first time recorded was 1921. That part of Texas is called the flash flood alley. When it comes, it comes, and this is something that even the weather service was warning people. But then it's like, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Are we safe? And within hours, few hours, the river rose to that 29 feet. That is almost 3 stories. So anything in its path is going to get affected. And then how soon can you evacuate to avoid this kind of stuff? But 100 or so people that died. Is that a good number? Is that something that we should say, well, more could have happened? One death is just too hard. But that's nature, and what we've seen Mother Nature destroy the most strong engineering effort. You saw what happened in Japan some years ago. Tsunami came in and wiped things out. All over the world. And but of course, the voodoo scientist, might say, oh, climate change. I don't subscribe to that, because this thing's been happening ever since human beings find themselves on Earth. So we just say, hey, hopefully it doesn't happen again, but it's going to happen. We just don't know when. And the technology is supposed to help us, give us enough notice so that we can, run away from it. But sometimes you can't run far enough.
Well, one thing about Mother Nature, you can never escape Mother Nature. As long as we live on this planet, Mother Nature controls the planet. So that's just the reality of that. I mean, there's one of those things. And once again, my condolences go out as well. I should have said that up front, and I appreciate you saying that, because one of the big devastating consequences is that there's a camp there for young children called
Yes,
Camp Mystic. I think
yes,
it's a young camp for women, and I believe there's what 10 young girls missing, and they're counseling.
yes,
Is that correct?
yes, yes.
Yeah. So about what I've been reading, once again, this is why I wanted to talk to you more about it, is that you've been reading. Listen, you're a politician. You know how things work. Everyone wants to put blame on something else, and no one, and everyone's blaming. Well, there could have been more notice. There could have been, that they were warning about it. But do you think that the National Weather Service, number one, failed, and the locals failed, or do you think it's just not much could have been done?
Well, no, no, I mean, we can look back to it and say, like, what else can we have done, differently? Notices were sent out. There are social media, police, and county sheriff. But again, there are people that will say, hey, this ain't gonna happen, and they're just gonna wait it out, and then it happens. I mean, 20 years ago, and when we had Katrina, I mean, we saw what happened at that. There have been some signs, warning signs, put along the river, but it's not. I mean, the whole stretch of the river, you're not going to have that. This river for the past, like I said, since 1998 was the last flood. There was only 10 people, but the serious one was 1921. So, of course, there are going to be people, especially in a contentious political environment we have, those who want to blame somebody. But at the end of the day, I think that's an insensitive position to be in, because nobody, no politician would like to see people die just so that they can, I don't know what score they're going to get out of it. So the blame game is going to go on. The conspiracy theorists are going to have things to say. But I don't believe. I think it's just something that is very unfortunate. We saw it coming, but whatever efforts we made to prevent it, it just wasn't enough. And of course, we're going to go back to the drawing table and see if there's something else we can do.
Yeah, what's one thing you mentioned about people not taking warnings seriously? I lived for a few years in Florida, and every year we would get hurricane warnings. Hey, you need to evacuate. You need to evacuate. And I'd say 98% of the time, the warnings, people, you would evacuate and realize that nothing happened to your homestead. But this is where I think people just, once again, my humble opinion is that when you're told to evacuate, you should evacuate. It shouldn't, it's not a risk that you should be willing to take, in my opinion. And the other thing I'll agree with you on is there's no elected official in the United States, especially, that would trade a human life for anything, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever. I mean, human life is very, very important, and so I don't think that anybody was shortchanging anything, at the risk of human beings. But let me ask you something about. Once again, I don't want to make this political, but I do have a couple of questions for you. Do you think that because these are the kind of questions that people have been sending me online? There's this talk about the cuts at the National Weather Service, that and somehow because the federal government's cutting of the National Weather Service, is that was one of the reasons. Now, personally, I don't see how that could be the case, but do you think that there's any merit in that as far as budget cuts causing any of this?
No, I don't think so. Remember the plane crash in Reagan National, where a helicopter collided with an airplane? They said, because, there was a cut in FAA, and then that's what led to that. That's not true. But again, you got to have people, whatever, that's going to find a reason to make their own point look like it's reasonable. I don't think that's reasonable. The Weather Service people, once they saw this thing coming, they started sending notices, to local officials, to everybody, the responders, the Texas Emergency Response Team. They sent them notices and they started getting ready. And then, when you talk about evacuation, remember when you're evacuating, you're going to be evacuating in the direction of the danger, opposite, running that way. And then you're going to have roads. So you may even tell people to evacuate and they get stuck on that highway. Katrina was one good example, where people got stuck on the highway. And then what happens? They got swept away, by stuff. So, I wish. There's no magic wand to this stuff. The natural disaster has been with us ever since we found ourselves and started keeping records. I think we need to, tune it down a little. But, the political mongers are going to have reason to say whatever they say, hoping that this is going to give them some point. But it doesn't give anybody a point, because we don't know what is going to happen next week. You know what I mean? These things come so often, and then the most recent thing becomes history. Nobody remembers it. I think it's the media. Once the media move their camera to something else, that other thing is forgotten. It goes back into the memory. It's like, oh, really? Did that happen? So I don't think any cuts in budget was the reason for this. The Weather Service, did what they could, and then what happened. So there's no blame game here. It's not like they didn't say anything. 3 days before the July 6th, they were out there issuing, forecast predictions and telling people, hey, be on the alert, be aware this is coming, get prepared. And even with 3 days or 4 days before the actual flooding, how do you manage, going from 7 inches of rain all of a sudden 26 in less than an hour? I live in a house and have a swimming pool, and I have a drainage system around my. Anytime rain is coming, I get out to make sure that my system is not clogged, so that at least that water can flow. Sometimes what makes this flooding happen so fast is, a lot of debris gets in the way of the, water channel, and they start ponding, and all of a sudden it piles up. If there's anything we can do differently, and what I would suggest that some of our rivers, especially where people live, get cleared, because we have trees that fall into this riverbed, and they too become an obstacle to river flow. Water has to find its level, and when that flow chart is obstructed, it's going to start backing up. And all of a sudden, the flooding goes over the bank and then it gets on the street. So those are some of the engineering, things. But again, you could do all of that, and then Mother Nature just pours it on you and overwhelms you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is the problem with being, elected official, working in government, is that there are limited resources at the end of the day.
Yes.
And I was my previous guest. I was talking about this documentary about terrorism in London, and they were interviewing former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he was very honest. He said, when you have thousands and thousands of terrorists, you have to pick and choose which ones you follow, because you can't follow all of them. There are limited resources, and not only in terrorism, but in every aspect of government. It's not a blank check. And so we live in a world. I'm in politics every day as well, and you have voters out there complaining, well, why aren't you doing this? But I don't want to pay any more taxes, and the government saying, well, we don't have enough resources. Then we have to cut something. So it's a no winning game if you're in government in many ways. And so I do feel some empathy and sympathy for elected officials having to try to figure out how to prioritize, because you just never know. Once again, this is what they call 100-year floods,
Yes.
and then you just can't. You just never know when the 100-year flood's going to come. It's not on the 100th day of, or the day one of the 100 years. It doesn't work that way. But you listen. You're a guy who run for office before in many ways, and I have a feeling you might run again in the future. But where do you think when it comes to natural disasters, just out of curiosity, where do you think that the responsibility? What is the divide between state government and federal government? I mean, does the federal government should take a more active role, or do you think the state should take a more active role? And when it comes to disaster response and when things like this happen?
I think the federal government has the biggest resources. We are 50 states in America, but oftentimes we act like 50 nations, because every state has got their own rules. They have their own legislature. They have their own Senate and House of Representatives. And from there, you go down to the county level, you go to the municipal level. And then even some areas are what we call the ETAs, extraterritorial jurisdictions, where they say, I don't want to be bothered by anybody. I'm going to live here by myself. So when things like this happen, it's still human beings you got to deal with. It's still how do you coordinate? So the federal government, when we have a disaster this huge, of course, they're going to declare, national disaster emergency, and the president comes in, and if there are other resources, those resources are given in support with whatever the state is doing or the local government. It's never a time they say, well, we're not going to go there. It's, have fire, like you see what happens in California all the time, the wildfires. As many times as we have technology to address with that, the state people say, oh, don't cut down the tree, I'm a tree hugger, blah, and then the fire happens, and then the more thing happens. So we are constantly facing that, because again, we live in a country where everybody has an opinion, even sometimes when those opinions are crap. They still have to express it, because freedom of speech is part of our living in America. So now I think the federal government has always been responsive. The politics of Democrat or Republican never gets in the way of the federal government responding to when we have a disaster like this.
And one thing that I'll ask you about as well is that FEMA. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about cutting FEMA, and putting that more on the state responsibility. I would argue that, once again, you summed up well. We have 50 different, I don't know exactly what you said, but in the United States, we have 50 different states vying for doing 50 different things. But when it comes to disaster response, because Mother Nature, once again, doesn't respect state lines, Mother Nature goes wherever she wants to go. And so I think this is one of those things where the federal government should take the lead role in all occasions on this, because they do have the abilities to do it, especially across jurisdictional lines. Because the other thing is, like, if something happens in Dallas, it doesn't just happen in Dallas, right? It could happen in multiple counties. And so how do you coordinate that? So this is where I think the larger and the highest governmental entity, a body needs to address that. So, listen, you're Nigerian. I always, we have a Nigerian audience, so I want to ask you this, because one thing I appreciated on your last show is how straightforward you were about your feelings about what's happening in Nigeria. But when it comes to natural disasters in Nigeria, do you think that the country is prepared for that? I mean, do you think that they operate correctly in that regard?
Again, I'm being honest. You know, natural disaster is going to happen, but in the case of Nigeria, they don't even make the effort to have an engineering, resources to channel the water. You ask many Nigerian engineers, do they have a stormware? Heck no. I grew up in Enugu. The colonial administration back then, they built a stormware. When it rains, you could see where the water going. But since the Nigerian part of the administration took over, those things have been, clouded, and nobody. I mean, that's where they dump trash. You look at Lagos. Look at Lagos, for instance. I mean, you look at Lagos with 20-something million people, assuming if that number is correct. If Lagos were to be a state in Europe, it'd be maybe number 4th largest country with the smallest real estate. It has no sewer system. It has no water system. It has an open gutter, and those gutters are clogged. And then the road network. I mean, if you were to say people in Victoria Island were to evacuate, is it not one way out? How many people will get into that? So the Nigerian part of things, granted that Mother Nature can come in and do a whole lot of things, there is no civil work project in Nigeria that works. When I grew up back in the 50s and 60s, that's what they call the Public Works Department. These were people that maintained the roads, make sure the debris are not clogging the gutters, and then make sure the grass are not growing onto the road system. In Nigeria today, you could see grass and trees growing onto the road, obstructing visibility. If you drive at night in Nigeria, you better have your heart in your hand, because you never see where the road is going to wind and where it's coming in the opposite direction. So yes, Nigeria is, centuries backward. And the annoying thing is that they don't even have the local engineering capacity to do it. Because if a contract were to be awarded today in Nigeria to get the road system done, what are you going to see happen? They run to Lebanese and Indians and Pakistanis to go and do it. Despite the fact that Nigerians are claiming to be professor of engineering and blah, all those titles they put before and after their name, they don't have the local capacity to do it. And the state governors act like, they are the father of their state. Nobody gets anything done without the blessing of the state governor or the president and, going to, the highest political figure. So those are the challenges for Nigeria. They are not running, you've heard the phrase, Nigerians are smart. But then let me ask you, how come smart people are not running a smart country? It has to be evident.
Yeah.
You can't say you're smart and then you don't have power. Electricity came to Nigeria 1896, 64 years before independence. America had electricity 106 years after independence. In 1882, that was when the first power plant was built. So 14 years separates Nigeria and America from having electricity. But today, the installed capacity in Nigeria is less than 10,000 megawatts. So, what is there to beat your chest about? When the infrastructure that will enable higher standard of living doesn't exist, it's not your mansion, it's not your Rolls Royces. I mean, geez, when I was in high school, one of my schoolmates, his father was driving a Rolls Royce. But where are they? Where are they today? That Rolls Royce is sitting in his home garage in a house that's been overlooked and forgotten. So when Nigerians show all this flashy, expensive stuff, that's not what makes life worth living. It has to be on the things that the average Nigerian can get to. Don't have to have policemen with AK-47 guarding them. I mean, come on, man. I mean, even during the Biafran time, we didn't have that many, people living like that. So when it comes to the infrastructure, Nigeria doesn't have it, and Nigeria is not going to have it in the next 50 years.
Oh, listen, I appreciate it. I definitely touched the nerve there, and I agree with you. There's so many things, and this is where I just think one thing on the show is that the globe, we're one big unit. Mother Nature's everywhere, as we talk about, and what's happening and there needs to be lessons learned from what's happening in Texas to around the world, and then that's very, very important. So, listen, I really appreciate you being on the show again. It's always a pleasure seeing you. You're very articulate about these issues, and it's very informative. So, thanks a lot, and thanks for joining me, Dane Waters, for Around the World with Dane Waters. And we will see you next week, same time, same place. Thank you very much.